First story, The Uninvited Guest by Mark Johnson. It was a cold winter evening in Boise, Idaho, and I found myself home alone. My wife, Sarah, had taken our kids to visit her parents for the weekend. I didn't mind being alone. In fact, I looked forward to a bit of peace and quiet. Little did I know that the night ahead would be far from peaceful. As I settled into my recliner to watch a movie, I heard a faint noise coming from the back of the house. It sounded like a quiet whisper, and I immediately thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me. Boise winters can be windy, and our old house often creaks and groans. But the whispering continued, growing more distinct. It was as if someone was murmuring in the distance. My heart quickened, and I got up to investigate. As I moved through the dark hallway, the whispering grew louder, and it was clear that it was coming from the basement. The basement was a place I rarely ventured into at night. The stairs leading down seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness below. I flicked on the basement light, and the whispering abruptly ceased. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, and a shiver ran down my spine. I descended the stairs slowly, clutching a baseball bat I found in the closet. The basement was filled with an eerie silence, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I began to search the basement room by room, finding nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to convince myself it was all in my head, I heard a noise behind me. Turning, I saw a figure standing in the far corner of the basement. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothing, his face obscured by shadows. My heart pounded as I realized that a complete stranger had invaded my home. I had no idea how he had entered, but that was the least of my worries at that moment. The man stood perfectly still, not saying a word. I mustered the courage to speak. "Who are you? What are you doing in my house?" He remained silent, and I took a step closer. The dim basement light revealed his face, which was twisted into a sinister grin. That grin sent a chill through my entire body. Without warning, he bolted toward me, and I swung the baseball bat with all my might. The sound of it connecting with his shoulder was sickening, and he crumpled to the floor. I immediately called the police, who arrived within minutes to apprehend the intruder. They told me he was a homeless man who had somehow gained access to my house through a broken basement window. I couldn't help but shudder at the thought of what might have happened if I hadn't gone to investigate that whispering. That night in Boise, I learned that sometimes the real horror isn't in the supernatural, but in the very real threats that can invade your home when you least expect it. Second story, The Mysterious Footsteps by Emily Parker. I lived in a cozy, old house in the historic district of Savannah, Georgia. One evening, my husband, James, had to leave town for a business trip, leaving me alone in our picturesque home. Savannah, with its moss-draped oak trees and antebellum charm, is a place filled with beauty and history, but that night, it revealed a darker side. I was sitting in the living room, engrossed in a novel when I first heard it, a faint sound of footsteps. At first, I dismissed it as a product of my imagination, but the footsteps continued, growing louder and more distinct. They were coming from the hallway leading to our bedroom. My heart raced as I listened intently. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, as if someone was deliberately trying to unnerve me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering to the operator about the intruder in my home. Terrified and unable to flee, I decided to confront the trespasser. Clutching a heavy candlestick, I slowly made my way down the hallway. The footsteps grew louder, and I could feel the weight of each step reverberating through the wooden floor. I turned the corner, ready to strike, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. I began to doubt myself, thinking I had perhaps overreacted. But just as I turned to retreat, I heard a whisper coming from the bedroom. "You shouldn't have come." My heart sank, and I felt a cold sweat on my brow. I stepped into the bedroom and saw a man standing by the window. He was tall and dressed in old-fashioned clothing that looked straight out of the 19th century. The moonlight revealed his pale, gaunt face, and his eyes were dark and hollow. "What do you want?" I stammered, still clutching the candlestick. He didn't answer, just stared at me with an eerie intensity. Panic set in as I realized there was no way out of the room, and I was trapped with this mysterious intruder. I edged back toward the door, trying not to take my eyes off the man. Just as I reached the doorway, he lunged at me, and I swung the candlestick with all my strength, hitting him on the head. He collapsed to the floor, unconscious. The police arrived shortly after and took the intruder into custody. They said he was a drifter who had been living in the area. The strange part was that he claimed he had no memory of entering my house or any recollection of what he had said to me. That night in Savannah, the beauty of the historic district concealed the terror that could lurk within its old, charming homes, leaving me with the haunting memory of those footsteps and the enigmatic intruder. Third story, The Midnight Caller by Rebecca Turner. It was a rainy night in London, and I was alone in my flat, feeling grateful for the cozy ambience and the sound of rain against the window. As I settled in, I noticed that the time had slipped past midnight. That's when the call came. My phone rang, and I picked it up, assuming it was a wrong number or a telemarketer. But the voice on the other end was shaky and filled with desperation. "Please, you have to help me. They're outside my door," the voice said. Confused, I asked, "Who are you? What's going on?" The caller didn't answer my questions but kept pleading for help. I could hear muffled voices and what sounded like a struggle in the background. Panic surged through me as I realized this was no ordinary call. "Where are you?" I asked, my heart pounding. The voice finally gave an address nearby. It was a few blocks away, and without thinking, I told the caller to stay on the line and rushed out into the rain. The adrenaline was pumping, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something terrifying. The address led me to an old, rundown building. The rain beat down relentlessly as I approached the entrance. I hesitated for a moment, but then took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Inside, it was dimly lit, and I could hear the echoes of distant footsteps. I followed the sound, ascending a creaky staircase to the upper floors. The sense of dread intensified with each step. As I reached the second floor, I saw a door cracked open, light spilling out into the dark hallway. I approached it cautiously and pushed the door open. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. A group of menacing figures surrounded the caller, who was on the floor, battered and bruised. They turned to face me, their faces obscured by masks. It was clear they weren't expecting anyone else. Without thinking, I rushed forward to help the caller, but the group quickly turned their attention to me. They began to advance, and I realized I was outnumbered. I could feel my heart racing as I looked for a way out. Just as they closed in on me, the police burst into the room, sirens blaring. The group scattered, leaving me and the caller behind. It turned out the police had traced my call and arrived just in time to intervene. The caller explained that they had witnessed a crime and had become a target of the criminals. They had dialed a random number for help, which happened to be mine. In the end, justice was served, and the criminals were apprehended. But that night in London, the sound of the rain outside couldn't drown out the fear and tension that had gripped me as I stumbled into a dangerous situation I never could have anticipated. Fourth story, The Stranger in the Woods by Daniel Carter. This chilling tale took place in a remote cabin in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. I had gone there for a weekend of solitude, deep in the heart of nature. The cabin was nestled far from any neighbors, and the nearest town was a good hour's drive away. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. I had just finished a simple meal when I heard a distant rustling in the woods. At first, I thought it was just a woodland creature, but the rustling grew louder, more distinct. It was as if someone was moving through the trees, approaching the cabin. My heart raced as I reached for the hunting rifle I kept in the corner of the room. I had heard stories of squatters and drifters in these woods, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was about to encounter one of them. The rustling continued, and I could hear occasional whispers in the wind. It was clear that someone was out there, and they were getting closer. My flashlight revealed nothing but the darkness of the forest, and I couldn't see who or what was approaching. I locked the cabin door and made sure all the windows were secured. I then called the local sheriff's office and explained the situation. They promised to send an officer out, but the cabin was so remote that it would take some time. As I waited, the noises outside became more unnerving. I could hear footsteps on the porch, and it sounded like someone was trying to open the door. The voice of a man drifted through the walls, low and menacing. "Let me in. I need shelter," he pleaded. My heart pounded, and I refused to open the door. The man outside grew more agitated, and his demands became increasingly threatening. "Open up, or I'll break in." I held my ground, knowing that my only option was to wait for the police to arrive. The man outside continued his attempts to force his way in, but the door held. It felt like an eternity, but the distant sirens eventually grew closer. As the police arrived, they confronted the intruder, who had grown even more aggressive. It turned out he was a mentally unstable individual who had been living off the grid for years. He had taken refuge in the woods and sought shelter in my cabin, unaware that it was occupied. That night in the Adirondacks, the beauty of nature had given way to a very real threat that had lurked just outside my door, leaving me shaken and forever wary of the dangers that could be hidden in the wilderness. Fifth story, The Disappearing Act by Laura Mitchell. This story takes place in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was home alone one summer evening, my husband at a late business meeting, and my kids at a sleepover. The house was peaceful, the street outside bathed in the gentle glow of streetlights. I was in the living room, engrossed in a novel, when I heard my front door open. I bolted upright, heart racing. I knew I had locked the door when my husband had left, and there was no reason for him to return so soon. I crept toward the hallway, my eyes trained on the front door. A chill ran down my spine when I saw a shadowy figure enter the house. They were quiet, moving with an eerie grace. My mind raced, and I considered calling 911, but my phone was in the living room, and I didn't dare go back. The intruder moved through the house with a sense of familiarity that made my skin crawl. I could hear them shuffling around the kitchen, opening and closing cabinets. As I watched, I realized they were moving without making a sound, like a ghost in my own home. I summoned every ounce of courage and silently approached the kitchen. But when I turned the corner, the intruder was gone. The back door stood open, revealing the night beyond. I was filled with a mixture of confusion and dread. I called the police, and they arrived shortly after. They searched the house and the surrounding area but found no trace of the intruder. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. My husband returned, and we spent the night on edge, unable to shake the feeling that someone had invaded our home. To this day, we have no explanation for who the intruder was or how they managed to disappear so completely. Sixth story, The Haunting Melody by Max Williams. This spine-tingling tale occurred in the heart of New Orleans, Louisiana, known for its rich history and vibrant culture. I lived in a historic French Quarter apartment, and on this fateful night, I found myself alone, the notes of a haunting melody echoing through the corridors. I was sitting in my dimly lit living room, enjoying the sultry jazz music that often drifted in from the street below. But as I settled in, the soft, eerie strains of a piano began to fill the air. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, and I couldn't resist following the sound. I ventured into the hallway, where the music was louder. It was coming from the apartment next door. I knew my neighbors were out of town, and the apartment should have been empty. Yet the piano played on, the notes growing more melancholic with each passing moment. I approached the neighbor's door, feeling an inexplicable urge to investigate. When I turned the doorknob, it swung open without resistance. The sight that met my eyes left me speechless. The room was bathed in an otherworldly, bluish light, and a grand piano stood in the center, playing itself. I watched in awe as the keys moved on their own, producing the haunting melody. There was no one at the piano, and the apartment felt icy cold, despite the New Orleans heat outside. The surreal sight sent shivers down my spine, and I slammed the door shut. I fled back to my apartment, locked the door, and called the building's maintenance. When they arrived, the music had ceased, and the apartment next door was eerily quiet. The maintenance crew entered the vacant apartment, only to find that the piano had fallen silent, and there was no sign of anyone inside. They claimed the apartment was perfectly normal, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something unnatural had occurred. That night in the heart of the French Quarter, I learned that even in a city known for its lively spirit, there are places where the line between the living and the dead blurs, and the melody of the past can still be heard. Seventh story, The Babysitter's Nightmare by Sarah Turner. My story takes place in a picturesque suburb of Boston, Massachusetts. It was a chilly autumn evening, and I had taken on a babysitting job for a family I had never worked with before. The house was a cozy two-story home, tucked away in a quiet cul-de-sac. As the parents left for their dinner date, they assured me that their 2 children were easy to handle and that they should be sound asleep by the time I arrived. They introduced me to the kids, a boy and a girl, and then departed, leaving me alone in the house. I settled in the living room, watching TV and occasionally checking on the kids through the baby monitor. Everything seemed normal, but as the night went on, I began to feel an uneasiness that I couldn't shake. Around midnight, I heard faint giggling coming from the children's room. I went upstairs to check on them, thinking that perhaps they had woken up. When I entered the room, my heart nearly stopped. The children were awake, standing at the foot of their beds and staring at the closet. Their faces were pale, and their eyes were wide with fear. The boy whispered, "He's in the closet." I felt a shiver run down my spine as I turned to the closet, which was partially open. The feeling of unease intensified, and I carefully approached it. The air grew colder, and I could sense a presence within. I slowly opened the closet door, and what I saw made my blood run cold. A man, gaunt and disheveled, crouched in the corner of the closet. His eyes were wild and filled with madness, and he whispered incoherently to himself. I grabbed the children and rushed out of the room, calling 911 as we fled the house. The police arrived quickly, and they apprehended the intruder. He turned out to be a homeless man who had managed to enter the house through an unlocked window. As the parents returned, they were shaken and profusely thanked me for protecting their children. They had no idea how the intruder had entered the house, and the thought of a stranger hiding in their closet was a terrifying revelation. That night in Boston, I learned that even in the quietest of suburbs, danger can lurk just beyond the walls of a seemingly safe home, turning a routine babysitting job into a nightmarish experience. 8th story, The Whispering Walls by Michael Harris. My unsettling encounter happened in an old farmhouse in the countryside of rural Vermont. I was there to house-sit for my aunt and uncle, who were away on vacation. The house was a rustic, charming place, with creaky wooden floors and the distinct smell of age. The first few days were peaceful, with the only sounds being those of chirping birds and rustling leaves. But as the nights fell, the house took on a different character. It started with faint whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I was lying in bed one night, the old wooden beams of the ceiling groaning softly. That's when I heard it, a low murmur, as if someone were talking just out of earshot. I dismissed it as my imagination, but the whispers continued, growing more persistent. The source of the whispers seemed to shift from room to room, as if they were moving within the walls. I checked the entire house, but there was no one else there. The whispers had an eerie, unnatural quality, like a language I couldn't comprehend. As the nights passed, the whispers grew louder, and they began to take on a more sinister tone. They seemed to be calling my name, beckoning me to follow them. I couldn't escape the feeling that something malevolent was trying to communicate with me. One night, I finally decided to follow the whispers. They led me to the basement, where the sound was the most pronounced. I descended the creaky stairs, my heart pounding with each step. The basement was shrouded in darkness, and the whispers reached a crescendo. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I felt a presence behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The whispers became deafening, and I couldn't bear it any longer. I fled back up the stairs and out of the basement, determined to leave the house. I contacted my aunt and uncle, who returned home immediately. They assured me that they had never experienced anything unusual in the house and had no explanation for the whispers. The farmhouse had been in their family for generations, and they had always considered it a place of comfort and solace. That night in rural Vermont, I learned that sometimes the most inexplicable and unsettling experiences can occur in the most unlikely of places, leaving me with a lingering sense of dread whenever I think about that old, whispering farmhouse. 9th story, The Midnight Stalker by Jessica Adams. My story takes place in a small apartment in the heart of San Francisco, California. I lived alone, and my city view apartment was my sanctuary from the bustling streets below. But that sanctuary would soon be shattered by an eerie presence. One night, I awoke to a sense of being watched. It was well past midnight, and my room was dimly lit by the city lights filtering through the window. The feeling was palpable, as if someone were standing just beyond the foot of my bed. I strained my eyes in the semi-darkness, and that's when I saw him, a shadowy figure, dressed in dark clothing, standing at the end of my bed. I couldn't make out any features, but his presence was undeniable. My heart raced, and I froze in terror. The intruder simply stood there, watching me in silence. I had no idea how he had entered my apartment, but his intentions were clearly sinister. I slowly reached for my phone on the nightstand, but as my fingers brushed it, the intruder moved. He darted across the room and out the door, disappearing into the hallway. I bolted out of bed, locked the door, and called the police. They arrived within minutes, but the intruder had vanished into the night. The police thoroughly searched my apartment building but found no trace of the man. They suggested it might have been a random break-in or an attempt at burglary. But there was something about the way the man had watched me that left me with an unsettling feeling that it was more than that. That night in San Francisco, I learned that even in the heart of a bustling city, one can become the prey of a lurking predator, and the shadows of the night can hold chilling secrets. 10th story, The Dark Secrets of the Attic by John Smith. This tale unfolds in a small cottage in the countryside of Oxford, England. The cottage was an old family heirloom, passed down through generations. I had inherited it recently and was in the process of renovating it. One night, as I explored the attic, I uncovered a terrifying secret. The attic was a dusty, dimly lit space, filled with old trunks and antique furniture. I was sorting through some old family heirlooms when I heard a soft thumping sound coming from the corner of the attic. I dismissed it as a mouse or a bird, but the noise continued. I ventured closer to the source of the sound, and that's when I saw it, a trapdoor hidden under a pile of old blankets and trunks. I pulled it open, revealing a narrow, rickety staircase leading down into darkness. As I descended, the thumping grew louder, and the air became heavy with the scent of decay. The staircase led to a cramped, dimly lit chamber, and in the corner, I saw a wooden crate. It was emanating the sound that had lured me there. I hesitantly opened the crate, and what I found made my blood run cold. Inside was an emaciated man, shackled and bound. He was barely conscious, his eyes filled with fear and desperation. It was clear he had been kept in this wretched place for an extended period. I called the authorities, who arrived promptly to rescue the man. He had been a victim of human trafficking, abducted and held captive in my attic for months. The cottage had been in my family for generations, and it seemed that the secret chamber had remained hidden for just as long. That night in Oxford, I learned that even in the most peaceful and idyllic settings, the darkest of secrets can lurk, waiting to be uncovered, leaving me with a profound sense of unease and the knowledge that I had unwittingly stumbled upon a horrifying past. Thank you for joining us for the whole video. That video you see on screen is one of my favorite. Check it out. If you've enjoyed these horror stories, show your support by hitting the subscribe button. Did this tale send chills down your spine? Let me know in the comments.